Hello, everybody. This is Jeff Dalto with the Convergence Training Blog, another one of our audio webcast podcast series. Today, we have a guest from Learning and Development. Pretty excited. We have Michelle Ockers, who is an independent learning and development professional in Australia, and she'll be talking about learning organization theory. So I've been following Michelle for quite some time. Great source of information. I think you guys are really going to enjoy that. And with that, let me say hello to Michelle. Hi, Michelle.
Hey, Jeff. Thank you for inviting me to talk with you today.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really excited to have you on and really appreciate it. So we're going to talk about learning organizations and being an learning organization, what it means and why you would do it and how you do it in just a moment. But before we dive into that, maybe if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and your professional background, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So in brief, I've got a lot of background in logistics, in both the aviation industry and in manufacturing. I worked in the Air Force for 16 years. I've worked in manufacturing environments. I've also, worked in more white-collar environments as well, but heavily in that manufacturing and aviation space. I work these days more at a strategic level, and I predominantly work through learning and development teams, but sometimes directly with business leaders, looking at making sure that what we do with learning in organisations has an impact on performance. So I'm very business focused. I always start with what does the business need, what's going to make a difference to performance, and how do we make sure we're doing things and lining things up in a way that will work. So a lot of the work I do is around developing strategies and operating models for learning in organisations and directly building the capability of learning and development teams.
All right, great. So we're here to talk about learning organizations. I wonder if you could start by telling us what the heck that means.
Yeah, I wish there was a simple answer to that question. I'm going to try to make this as demystify the whole concept of a learning organisation during the course of today, and hopefully give people something that's simple enough that they can use it and get their heads around it, and it's a bit actionable and practical, but it's not so simple that it doesn't do the job of building organisations that are adaptable and innovative, which at the end of the day is, and I know we're going to talk about why would an organisation want to be a learning organisation, but it's really about adaptation to whatever's changing in the organisation. So one of the resources I'd like to have in the show notes is a book that was recently published by Nigel Payne called Workplace Learning. And one of the things he does is he does a bit of a history of the thinking around the learning organisation, which has really evolved since the early 1990s. And what is clear, if you look at that, is it's just not straightforward, and we're still figuring out how to build a learning organisation and what makes for a learning organisation. So a lot of people may recall Peter Senge. He wrote a book in early 1990s, The Fifth Discipline, where he talked about a learning organisation being about a group of people who work together collectively. So it's about people working together, about collective knowledge and learning to build capabilities, and that creates results they care about. Now, Senge was quite high level. He was quite visionary in his day, but people struggled to implement his ideas because it wasn't actionable enough, and it was just a bit too complex. Too many disciplines, too many rules, hard to actually do it. But in the 1980s, Harvard Business Review, or the Harvard Business School, there was a guy named David Garvin who talked about, he gave a far more practical definition, and he basically said, look, a learning organisation is an organisation that is good at creating knowledge, acquiring knowledge, and transferring knowledge, and then using both the knowledge that's being shared as well as what they're creating, being able to change their behaviour appropriately. So that's that, again, that idea of adaptation. And what's common for kind of all the history of people talking about what a learning organisation is this idea of being able to challenge assumptions, to challenge the way we think, the way we work. Technically, it's called double loop learning, but it's really just about not taking as a given the frameworks, the way we look at the world. So let me give you an example to show what that might look like, to make it a bit more real, if that's okay.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. So one of the challenges we can have if we become very good at something is that we can develop blind spots, because we think our past experience is a good predictor to the future, and we can make poor decisions. It's called trained incapacity, but basically it's about blind spots. So, for instance, Polaroid had a blind spot to digital video technology, and ultimately they fell off the radar, right? They didn't keep up because they failed to see that that was the way of the future, because they were so expert in old-fashioned ways of producing photos and videos. Here in Australia, there's a bank called ING who are asking their staff and their leaders to think more like a technology company than a bank. And you've probably got, these online-only banks in the US, and they're actually digital companies first rather than banking companies. And I think we're seeing that a lot. There's a lot of organisations starting to realise they need to be in the digital space and asking their people not to think traditionally about their industry, but to adopt this different mindset. So a learning organisation can look at what is happening in their environment, can kind of start making sense of it. It can have a flow of conversation, a flow of knowledge, a flow of experience within the organisation to figure out how do we respond to this and adapt and build new capabilities. Does that make sense?
It does. It's and I'm glad, because originally you talked about changes in the organization, reacting to change within the organization. But I'm glad you mentioned it, also reacting to changes externally. I was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. We have these auto companies, right? And now maybe they're becoming tech companies in the same way you just described, and their competitors are Google and Amazon, and not just Ford and Chrysler and GM. I wonder, a couple other things. I wonder, could you show us that Nigel Payne book that you were talking about, so everyone can know how to buy that?
This is on video as well, is it?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
There you go. Workplace learning.
And you taught me something. It's Sengi, not Senj, huh?
Oh, I hope so. We better check that. I've always called him Sengi, but maybe it's Senj. But he was kind of considered the father. There was actually a guy before him who wrote a book called The Learning Organisation, called Bob Garrett, in 1987 in the UK. So they were working on this around the same time independently, and they didn't credit or acknowledge each other's work. But whereas Sengi was too complicated, Bob Garrett was probably a little too simple.
Yeah. But so I just learned about this Garrett guy a week or two ago, so that rings a bell. I had the same thought about Senj or Sengi, that it seemed kind of abstract, and how there was no obvious way to apply it, even if a lot of it was good. And your touchstones, Garvin, and I know we're going to talk about people Garvin worked with, Gino and Edmondson shortly as well. So that all sounds familiar to me. Great intro. So if that's, kind of what a learning organization is, and again, could you repeat the Garvin definition? Do you have that written down?
I do. I'll read it out. It's from a 1983 article in the Harvard Business Review, which I'll give you a link to. The article is called Building a Learning Organisation, and I'll read it out verbatim. An organisation skilled at creating, acquiring and transferring knowledge, and at modifying its behaviour to reflect new knowledge and insights.
Great, and I'm sure we'll touch on this, but that second part is really important, modifying the behavior. Yeah. So,
yeah, that's essential.
Okay, that's what a learning organization is. Why would I want to do it? Why is that a good idea for an organization to be a learning organization?
Yeah, are there things changing in your environment? Are they changing quickly? Is the pace of change accelerating? Digital disruption, technology's moving on. Our customers' expectations are shifting. We need to be able to respond to all of their things to basically stay in business and to thrive. So being a learning organisation is being about being able to adapt, to sense what's going on around us, to make changes in not only how we engage with customers, for instance, and the services and products we offer, but how we work internally to bring that all to life, and to make sure we can deliver something new, something more appropriate, something more effective. So we're bringing like the whole power of the organisation. And often, and we'll talk a little bit about some examples of hackathons, right? Often it's about going beyond the boundaries of the organisation and bringing in knowledge and experience from outside the organisation to create solutions and allow us to change so we can do a better job at servicing our customers, remaining profitable and competitive. So it's all about adaptability and innovation.
All right, great. So like classic examples would be, the taxi industry and getting Ubered or Lyfted.
Well, absolutely. So here's a couple of examples I wanted to share. And one is about driverless cars, right? So there's quite a few organisations working on autonomous vehicles now, driverless cars. Mercedes-Benz have got this interesting concept car which they call the F015. And one of the interesting things about it is they're not just saying, well, it's about the car being able to move around without a driver, but they've thought about the space inside the car. So if people aren't driving, what are they doing? They're looking setting it up to create it into a space which could be used for business meetings or for socialising, right? So they're thinking ahead to that and what kind of technology can we put inside the car so all of a sudden it has a very different purpose. So that's a good example of adaptation and thinking outside of the traditional mindset around what does it look like. WestJet, who are a Canadian airline, I don't know if you've ever heard of them. They're about 20 years old. Aviation has been a fairly traditional industry for a long time, but more and more aviation is going digital and thinking about servicing customers more effectively using digital technology, using innovation. So they had a hackathon last year, their first ever, to look at solutions for their premium travellers and how to provide better service for their premium travellers. They had 120 people from 17 different technology companies come along. They had people from Facebook, Amazon, Google, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat. They've got nothing to do with the aviation industry, really. They also had around 37 staff and a dozen customers. So they're bringing the customers into the process. And they basically had this hackathon looking at, given what we know about the structural limitations of our industry, we're heavily regulated. We will continue to be heavily regulated. Safety is critical. What can we do to better service our premium customers was the question they worked on. And, they came out of that experience, reframing themselves as a digital company that happens to fly aircraft. So it's this shift in thinking, right, and challenging fundamental assumptions and seeing things differently and pulling knowledge from all over the place to adapt.
So I don't know if you have Blockbuster video stores in Australia, but clearly you must have had brick and mortar video stores. Am I correct?
We had Blockbuster video stores. We don't have them anymore.
We have one more. It's 200 miles south of my home. It's in Bend, Oregon. But that's another classic example of an industry that got disrupted by a new technology, streaming video. And that's a huge change that these organizations have to be prepared for and have to react to.
Yeah, real estate is another industry which is completely changing through technology, right? And the range of services that are now being offered and what is thought of as a real estate service now is quite different.
Yeah.
So a lot of reframing that organisations have to do and seeing themselves differently.
Yeah. And I don't want to drag us too far offline, but I hadn't thought about the autonomous. I have heard the discussion about the autonomous car and what will people do inside of it. Which actually the article I read was a lot more hanky-panky. But I like that your notion of we should design something for these people to do, because I used to be busy and now I'm not, and it's a nice tie-in to like design thinking, which we won't get into, but maybe in a future conversation. So great. So we know what a learning organization is. We kind of know why you'd want to be one. Could you give us a bird's eye view of what some of the characteristics of a learning organization might be? Yeah,
sure. And, you can kind of go cross-eyed trying to figure that out with all of the different frameworks and points of view, because we're still learning about this. We're still figuring this out, and it's not simple. But what I've done is I've pulled a framework from Harvard Business School, which was actually published in 2008. So it is a little bit dated, and I'm going to talk about some of the updates to it to make it contemporary and current for today's world. But it is something, an assessment tool was developed. So David Garvin, who we mentioned before, Amy Edmondson, who I know we're going to talk about a little bit more, and her work around psychological safety safety and setting up safe environments for people in organisations and teams. And Francesca Gino did this work based on sort of 30 years of research around organisations and thinking about adaptability in organisations and learning organisations. And they put together a self-assessment tool. So one of the reasons I've picked their framework is that it covers quite a few dimensions within the self-assessment tool, but gives you something that you can actually use to figure out, well, where are we at and what might we focus on as a start point. But they also say all three of these building blocks, and they've organised the tool into 3 building blocks, they're saying all of them have got to be in place. It's not as simple as just saying we can work on one to the detriment of the others. They're all important. So they talk about a supportive learning environment, concrete learning processes and practices, and they give specific processes and practices, and leadership that reinforces learning. So I think that's quite useful as a start point, but I would also overlay some of the thinking from Nigel Payne's book, which I shared with you a moment ago, where he talks about the critical components of a learning culture. And of course, an organisation has a culture, so they're slightly different in concept. So he talks about these being things that are fundamental to have in place, or you're not going to be able to create a learning organisation. So he talks about trust, collaboration, purpose and sharing. Now, I think 3 out of those 4 elements are adequately covered in the Harvard framework, but the one I want to call out and maybe talk a little more about with you is the idea of purpose and a sense of shared purpose and why that's important in a learning organisation.
Great. I like that addition of the 4th, which, again, we mentioned earlier, I think kind of harkens back to what Sengi said as well. I do have a question before we move. I know we're going to drill down into each of those 4 points in a second, but the Harvard Business Review article you're talking about by Gino, Garvin, and Edmondson, which I think is called "Is Yours a Learning Organization?"
That's right.
Self-assessment in it, which is a really cool idea. But I've never been able to make that assessment work. Like there's something wrong with like the scoring or something. Am I wrong? Should I go back in and try it again? Is it workable?
Look, I think it is, but I would caution people from using it in its current form. I would suggest it's a start point because, as I say, it's like 2008, so it's 11 years out of date. Mm-hmm. And I think there's some subtle shifts, but I think it's a great place to start with, you know, a set of dimensions and questions that you might consider looking at. But I would, I would just create my own and work with my own off the back of that and maybe update it a little bit.
All right, great. Okay, so let's dig deeper into each of those. The first one is a supportive learning environment, and they had different examples of what that meant. Could you tell us, in your mind, what does that mean, supportive learning environment?
Yeah. So nowadays we tend to use the term ecosystem, which is a bit jargony, but if you see talk around learning ecosystems or performance ecosystems, it's kind of the same thing around an environment. And I think there's 3 key elements in an environment. One is the resources, another is people, and thirdly, it's around the underlying environment, which includes technology and talent management, for instance. Often people think that these learning environments are all around technology, and a lot of vendors of platforms have kind of hijacked the idea that if you put our platform in place, voila, you'll have a learning environment. But it's actually not true. It's much bigger than that. But the idea of a learning environment is to reduce the friction, to make it easier for people to learn, and in particular to learn as they work. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that when we move on in the conversation. So it's about enabling people to learn continuously, to have this more fluid sharing of knowledge, to be able to access resources they need in the flow of work and to do their job. So there's a really big question now around how do we enable individuals to own their own learning? And I think that question wasn't such a big question in 2008, but we recognise now with the pace of change that this idea of helping people to be lifelong learners is really important. So creating an environment in which they are able to take charge of their own learning. Now, I'm not going to cover every single one of the elements of a supportive learning environment, but there are 2 I'd like to call out that I think are particularly important. And the first is this idea of psychological safety. Some people may have heard of it. It was popularised by some work that Google did, on a project they called Project Aristotle, which was, I think they started the work in 2012, and it took 3 years for them to do this piece of work. And they wanted to figure out what are the ingredients that make a high-performing team. And they spent a couple of years studying all their teams internally to try to figure out what it was. You know, was it diversity? Was it years of experience? And they just couldn't come up with anything. And then they kind of figured out the secret ingredient was this thing called psychological safety. But they didn't invent it. Amy Edmondson came up with it, and she identified it, I think in 2002, looking at cultures in the hospital system. And I'm going to talk a little bit about hospital and aviation and what we can learn from them in terms of creating environments where people can adapt and share knowledge and learn quickly in a moment. But basically, a psychological safety is about people feeling that they can speak up, that they can share information about what does and doesn't work, that they can ask questions, they can give feedback, they can discuss problems and disagreements, and that mistakes can be viewed as opportunities to learn, and it's not going to be held against them. So they're not going to be judged to be, incompetent because they're asking questions. People are not going to respond defensively. There's going to be open discussion around the questions and the issues and the concerns that they raise. So it's a bit about, it's kind of related to learning from failure as well, in a way, that you need environments where it's safe for people to say something or to ask questions or to admit that something didn't work, you know. And that's critical. Now, Edmondson's published a book recently, which I think you've read, Jeff, called The Fearless Organisation.
Right. I just read it. I'll have a blog post about it soon. And yeah, I didn't know that she was like the instigation of Google's Project Aristotle, so I'm glad you called that out.
Oh, she didn't instigate the project, but she was the one who originally came up with the concept of psychological safety. Oh. So it took Google 2 years to kind of uncover this and link it back and say, oh, it was about psychological safety, not about who we put on the teams or their working environment and conditions or anything like that. It was about people feeling comfortable just to bring their whole self and speak openly, right?
Okay, great. Yeah, but for those who have not, again, it's Amy Edmondson, The Fearless Organization, book about psychological safety, well recommended.
Yeah, and you know, it's got, I believe, I haven't taken a good look at it. I've read some reviews of it. It's got a toolkit for leaders inside it. So again, if people are looking for something actionable about, well, what can I do as a leader to help create an environment of psychological safety? You know, if you look at the Google research, a lot of the Google research was about leaders being vulnerable and being willing to say, I don't know, or ask a question, or even just share a little bit about themselves, that they're bringing their whole self and setting it as like almost a permission for others to do the same, that was really important to building trust in their teams.
Especially that I don't know.
Yeah. And these days, you know, things move so fast, that whole idea of, I don't know if you've heard the term the half-life of knowledge, that half of what we know in a particular field just turns over much more quickly. So, you know, it's no shame to be saying, I don't know, but I know how to figure it out, or I know how to find people. And this is the whole idea about the people element of a learning environment. I know how to find people who can help me with this. I know how to find people who know that I can work with and collaborate with, right? That's really critical.
Right. It's the whole thing about continual learning, lifelong learning, working out loud, working outside your organization, and even doing what you and I are doing now.
Yeah, absolutely. And the third element I want to touch on briefly, but it's a really big one. It's reflection and making time for reflection. We're so caught up in busyness and this idea that activity equals productivity. But you've got to make time to sit back and think about what you're doing, both at an individual level and at a team level, and you know, what you're learning from that and how to improve that. And there's lots of ways you can build in learning moments in an organisation. So maybe if I just share a couple that I think are quite relevant to the manufacturing environment in particular. One is, you know, just looking for natural points in the workflow where a question can be asked about learning. So a shift handover in a manufacturing environment, for instance. You know, normally there's some sort of handover meeting, at the very least between team leaders, often at the start of a shift. You know, there'll be a toolbox talk, or people will come together to have a conversation about what's happening and an update. Great opportunity to say, Here's what happened on the last shift, and here's what we did to fix that, and here's what we learned from that, or have a little reflective discussion. Root cause analysis in maintenance activities. If you're having trouble figuring out some sort of problem with your equipment, with your operation, and there's a process around root cause analysis to really dig into what's going on here in your diagnostic processes. Fantastic moments for reflection, so long as you capture the knowledge and what you're learning out of it and think about what can we change. So you're closing the loop and adapting, and I think that's a really good example. And one from WD-40. I don't know. Do you know what WD-40 is?
Yeah, spray on lubricant.
Yeah, everybody's got a can of that in their home, right? My daughter's door was squeaking at home. I used some yesterday to make the door stop squeaking. So they build in, you know how a lot of organisations, and I know you do a lot of safety work, a lot of organisations have safety moments built into their meeting structures. Yeah. So they'll often say, that they'll share a point about safety or a reflection on safety as part of a meeting structure. WD-40 build learning moments into their meeting structure as well. So in a lot of their recurring meetings, they'll have like a short share on what did you learn, what's something you learned this week, and they just quickly go around the table. And so that's kind of a pause, a reflection moment.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought up that third point of reflection, and which I think is really hard, really important, and really hard to do in a fast-paced life. Mm-hmm. And in particular, how that's important to do, but also capturing that knowledge, as you said, and then sharing it, which I think is a really big challenge. Is even if you do capture that knowledge, and one or two workers goes on and uses that again, if you could somehow find a way to spread that through the organization, that's a real victory. In terms of safety specific issues revolving around reflection, you talked about the root cause analysis, and I mentioned earlier there's kind of a alternative safety field, which actually I think in many ways goes back to Australia with a guy named Sidney Dekker, and people who practice what is called safety differently or safety 2 or HOP often use an alternative to a classic root cause analysis that they call a learning team, and it's a great team-based learning structure in order to do just that, to reflect and really to value the expertise of the workers and recognize that. And so the safety manager actually finds out what people do on the daily job instead of like work is imagined, really what is work is performed. And you can use that for safety incidents, but you can use it for quality incidents, or you can even use it for like successes and figure out why that success happened. So I think that whole reflection is really important but kind of hard to build into the workday.
It is, and I think you have to have, to really make the most of reflection, if we're talking about it at an organisational level rather than an individual level, which is a different discussion and part of lifelong learning anyway, you have to have some kind of mechanism to close the loop. So the Australian Army have a knowledge management team, and that after every military operation, military exercise, there's something called an after-action review that is done. And people look at what did we learn from that, right? It's probably a term that's familiar to people. But this knowledge management team captures all of that output, and they have what they call a lessons implemented register, not a lessons learned register. So they will follow up out of every one of those review processes. Part of what did we learn is about what are we going to do to implement it. And this group follows up and says, did that get implemented and how did that go? So they ask the second question around what did we learn from implementing it. And I think in terms of being a learning organisation, thinking about simple processes that we can use around the structure of existing work to ensure that we're deriving learning from it, that we're adapting and making changes to improve not productivity for today, but also insight for the future.
I like that having some kind of process for implementing the lessons from the after action review, and I've heard of that, and of course its cousin, the before action review. You've probably heard of something similar called the job pre-mortem. Yeah, those are all good opportunities for reflection. But I love that emphasis on let's share it and put it to work and make sure other people benefit from it as well. So yeah, I created a little list. We talked about access to learning, sharing learning, being a continuous learner, having ownership of your own learning, lifelong learner. We talked about Amy Edmondson and psychological safety. And something and everything you said about that was right too. So I just read that book, and I also like the idea that like when you're in an organization and you feel free to like share your opinions about what's working and what's not. I thought it was important. She said that, you know, you actually feel like something might happen as a result of that. So even if it's like all cool to tell your problem, if nothing ever happens, everyone's going to quit telling their problem eventually. So that was an important
absolutely. Yeah.
reflection. So good list. Thank you.
Welcome.
So if that's, that was supportive learning environment. The second characteristic you pointed out was concrete learning and practices. I'm sorry, learning practices and processes. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, so again, there's actually quite a long list in the Harvard model on this. I'm just going to pick up on a handful of them. This is about having processes for things that we can learn today to make us more productive and to improve performance today, as well as what's called generative learning, or learning that will prepare us for the future. That's about exploring the future and different ways of working, or you know, different products. It's more about the discovery process. So for example, learning for today can include training. It can include access to performance support resources, you know, job aids, for instance. It can include team-based continuous improvement activities with whatever methodology people have in place in their organisation for continuous improvement. Learning for tomorrow, you know, can include things like teaching people critical thinking skills. Mm-hmm. And they're skills, for instance, that allow us to challenge our own assumptions, or to identify the assumptions and frameworks we're using and change our thinking to process new knowledge or different points of view more effectively. So that's kind of like a core skill to build into people, into the organisation. It can include things like, you know, the hackathons we talked about, getting groups together to look at disruptive innovations and how that might impact your business model, things like that. And General Electric, I think it might have been in the 1990s, had a process called Break Your Business, where they used to get groups of people together to actually say, well, how could we break our business model? If we were a competitor trying to kill our business, what would we do? So it's that kind of group-based inquiry process, which can be really useful. And, you know, a lot of these practices we don't call learning practices. We call them, you know, innovation practices or continuous improvement practices. And I would update the language in that Harvard model from concrete learning processes and practices to, you know, I would make it just integrated working and learning practices. Because increasingly it's about how can we learn from work while we work? Because that's what people do, right. You know?
Right.
Learning isn't just something that happens in a training course.
I like the emphasis on innovation and continuous improvement there.
Yeah, so, you know, what do we need to do to innovate, to improve? We need to run experiments. Experimentation is a key process here. And there's a nice quote from the Amazon CEO, Jeff Bezos. He talks about if you double the number of experiments, you double your innovation. So you have to try new things. So learning from failure and having a failure-friendly culture is something that's important. That applies not just, you know, when you're experimenting, it's kind of okay to fail. You know, when you say I'm running an experiment, it makes it okay to try something and maybe have it not work.
Right.
Yeah. Now, when a genuine mistake is made in an operational environment, sometimes it's not okay to fail. And there are a couple of examples of industries where they truly do learn from failure, and aviation is probably the key one. You know, in terms of if there is an incident or an accident, there's an independent investigation team comes in. Globally, information on all aviation incidents or accidents is shared freely and openly between all parties in the aviation industry. So everybody gets to learn from everything that's going on. So, you know, there's some really good modelling of practices around incidents and things going wrong in aviation, and it's all around learning. And it's really driven it to be a remarkably safe industry, right? Because of this open sharing and learning environment. Hospitals have learnt a lot as well and model a lot of their practices from aviation in their quest to become safer environments. The legal industry is probably an example where there's high defensiveness and they have a lot of blind spots. So when DNA testing first came in and was available, and there was an opportunity to go back to a lot of cold cases, or a lot of cases where people have been put into jail, you know, in prison, found guilty of crimes, and the evidence had still been restored, there was an opportunity to go back and do DNA testing to test the veracity of the verdicts in those cases. And there was so much resistance, even in the face of the evidence, the DNA evidence showing that wrong decisions had been made. There was so much resistance. The idea from lawyers, from judges, from the system as a whole, the idea that they had made a wrong decision was really hard for them to face up to, because the consequences for them, you know, it's because they cared, really, because the consequences were so significant of making a wrong decision. So it's all around finding ways in your organisation. Obviously, you know, repeated failure or repeated mistakes are not okay, and there's, you know, performance standards to maintain, but finding a way to systematically learn from mistakes and build that into your learning. Something I will mention that's missing from the Harvard model, which has become increasingly important, is listening to customers. Yeah. And using data and data analytics. They do talk about measuring, but I think we're so much more sophisticated now with what's available in terms of data analytics, that using that well and building up a really good analytics capability in your organisation is critical and part of a learning organisation. And there's so much focus now on customer centricity. Customers have so much choice and have such a stronger voice now than they did 10 years ago. You know, to adapt and to improve, we need to be close to our customers, listening to them, inviting them in to look at how we operate and how we can better service them. Really critical. So I'd add that to the list. We haven't talked much about knowledge sharing and networking, but breaking down silos in the organisation is the other thing. So if you kind of pull all these things together, this list of things, and I know you're going to go over the list, for people in organisations thinking, well, how do we do more of this? I would be thinking about setting up cross-functional teams, if you're not already using cross-functional teams, to look at opportunities, to look at issues, you know, to run experiments cross-functionally, to look at some of your customer voice data and your customer listening, to say, what do we learn from this? And, you know, to do that, bringing people together from different disciplines, really important. You get different insights, right?
Yeah, I agree, and I that's a great idea. And I even think something as kind of humble as the Friday lunch and learn isn't a bad place to start either, you know?
Yeah.
But I like the idea of using cross-functional teams to kind of evaluate the voice of the customer. The voice of the customer idea has always kind of been big in lean manufacturing, which has always had a big emphasis on learning. And
yeah.
What you said completely jives with a lot of what I've learned as well. In safety, of course, it seems like the people at the vanguard of this safety differently in HOP movement often are in aviation and medical healthcare. And what you're talking about, like, oh, there's an incident, you know, people have to have that psychological safety to feel free to report it or talk about it with their manager, and they have to know that they're not going to get blamed, but the emphasis is going to be on learning something. You know, in this case, the safety manager can't be looking to blame employees, but to figure out what happened systemically. And that's when I think you really have this opportunity to learn, especially through this kind of like alternative to the root cause analysis that they call the learning team exercise.
Yeah, a really good example. And I like the fact you brought up, you know, sometimes it's as simple as a lunch and learn. Yeah. And that's an example where, you know, you can have some reflection and people asking questions and learning from each other, or trying to solve problems together as well. I worked at Coca-Cola Amateur, I think I might have mentioned that, for about 4 years. And one of the things we did was we set up some communities, we call them communities of practice, but groups of people across the organisation who, you know, were working on things that had strategically important capabilities. So, for instance, our maintenance planners was one community that we set up. And once a year we would bring them together. I mean, we do a whole stack of stuff online to support exchange of information and asking questions and helping each other to solve problems. But we'd bring them together and we'd do what we called an unconference. So the idea was, you come and we'll figure out the agenda on the day. We want everyone to talk about you know, what are their burning issues? What do they most need to improve? What are the barriers getting in their way of doing a better job with maintenance planning and managing, you know, the maintenance of the plant in their factory. And then we would form little teams to, you know, and run a process around sharing knowledge and problem solving around that. And, you know, you didn't solve everything in a day. So then we would continue those teams. But a really nice example of, you know, it wasn't a training session. It was genuinely a bring your problem and challenge. And we also used to run as part of those like a little, we called it a demo fest, which is like a show and tell. Talk about something that you've made improvements in and what you've done and share it with the others. So those simple things are really, really useful.
Yeah, especially if you're telling a story about that. But yeah, I love all those ideas and you know, the cross-functional thing where people are getting together. I think that's really important in breaking down those departmental silos. I think it's also important where you remember not just to break down the departmental silos, but to break down the hierarchy as well. So it's not just managers from multiple departments having those kind of meetings, you know, but the workers, the rank and file, who often again know more than managers do about certain things. And then I totally agree with you. I think there's a lot of marketing buzz where technology companies will tell you, like, we've got a learning platform. We have a learning ecosystem for you right out of the box. Become a learning organization by clicking this button. But I do think this is a case where, in addition to something kind of as humble as a Friday lunch and learn, some kind of technology to help you just share information can be helpful as well.
It can be pretty simple as well. And I think looking to the tools you've already got in place in your organisation, you know, so long as you're okay around the privacy and confidentiality issues, you check that out. I mean, tools like WhatsApp, setting up groups in WhatsApp. We found that worked really well at Coca-Cola Amatil. That was something the guys were already using. They were very comfortable to share problems and issues and help each other out, or just to use it to hold up their hand. I mean, we had our own intranet, and most organisations these days will. We could set up forums and so on, but nothing worked as well as stuff people were already familiar with. It doesn't need to be complex. You don't need a high technology spend to make progress on this stuff.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. It's a lot easier. I mean, I get tired of learning new technology all the time at work as well. So I'd much rather do it with something I already know.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was concrete learning practices and processes. And the third characteristic you identified from the Harvard Business Review source was leadership that reinforces learning. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, things like are people safe to talk up, you know, to speak out about things? How do we as an organisation react to a mistake? A lot of this gets down to leadership behaviours, right? And, you know, the senior leaders set the tone for the organisation. So it's partly about, you know, we think traditionally of what's the manager's role in learning? Well, to help people find training courses, to help them when they're back, to give them opportunity to apply their skills, maybe to give them some stretch assignments to build their skills in the workplace. But it's actually about a lot more than that. It's about the kind of conversations that managers have, whether managers seek input from others. You know, are they consultative? Do they listen? Do they, as I said before, do they acknowledge their own limitations in their expertise and seek information and input? Do they ask questions? Do they actively listen? Do they know how to engage people to get expertise onto the table and to facilitate a discussion around using that expertise to find improvements? Are they open to different perspectives? And, you know, it all starts with the CEO and the tone they set to a large degree. So I don't know if you kind of followed some of what's happened at Microsoft since their new CEO, Satya Nadella, has taken over in 2015. But there's been a big turnaround at Microsoft right in that time. There's a story about his first executive meeting. Before his first executive meeting, he had a book sent to all of his senior leaders and he asked them to read it. That book was called Nonviolent Communication by a guy called Marshall Rosenberg, and it was all about listening and communicating with empathy. And I think that sent a huge message to the tone he was setting and how he wanted his leaders to start communicating and engaging with their people. And so I think that's really critical. So, you know, in terms of, well, what can you do about that? You know, obviously looking at your senior leadership and what they're doing to role model, but also any of your leadership development programs, and really taking a good look at those. You know, coaching and support to individual leaders if necessary and appropriate. Yeah, most of us have had that experience of working in one organisation, but someone else who works in the same organisation, even in the same function, can have a very different experience based on the leader they have.
Right.
So looking for pockets of good practice. Where is trust high? You know, one of the organisations I work with as a business partner is called Towards Maturity. They're a research and analyst service based in the United Kingdom. They work with learning and development teams. They've been going 15 years, and everything is research-based and benchmarking-based around their work. And one of the pieces of work they do is called their learner intelligence work. So they will help you to look at what and how are people learning in your organisation, you know, what sort of digital technology are they using, how do they get better at their job. But they also look quite closely at how do their managers support their performance and help them to do their job better. And they ask managers some similar questions about how they think they're supporting their people. And then they compare what an individual manager said with what their direct reports said the people are in their team. And that often throws up, you know, normally that throws up some blind spots for the manager. Normally they're not doing as good a job as they could supporting their people, and creating this kind of environment to reinforce and enable learning. But what's interesting is sometimes you get a case where that isn't the case. So, for instance, when I worked with Qantas, I did a 12-month strategic piece of work with Qantas looking at learning across their organisation recently. And we ran this learner intelligence, which is survey-based, basically. You get as many people as you can from the organisation to fill in this online study. And we found this one area in the organisation where not only was there a common view between the managers and their team members about how well they were being supported to learn and to perform better, but it was really high. It was much higher than normal. So we're able to go and have a look at what's happening here, what's being done to create this environment where the leaders are supporting and reinforcing learning, and then to look at the practices and look at how could we replicate that elsewhere. So looking for examples of where it's being done well. And you may not need to go to the extent of, you know, doing a study. You may just be able to look around and you just kind of know where, you know, from people talking and from reputation, where you've got leaders who are doing this well and creating these kind of open environments, having discussions around improvement where it's okay to ask questions, where it's okay to fail and let's learn from that and move forward. And then look at their practices and, you know, how can you use them as role models, as champions? How can you help others to learn from that as well?
Well, you know, it's interesting because a lot of that seems like it comes back to the tenets of psychological safety. And Amy Edmondson will tell you that she thinks that's at the foundation of being a learning organization. I have heard the story about the new Microsoft CEO and the book he distributed, although I have not read the book. And could you remind me of the title of it? It's
called Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. I haven't read it either, but you know, he was obviously using it to send a clear signal.
Yeah. And you know, it sounds exactly like what Amy Edmondson's talking about in her book, that you need to have productive, meaningful conversations where you can talk about problems, but they're not going to get shut down, and you're going to feel like you're being listened to and all that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. So that's 3, but you kind of added a 4th, which was the idea of having a shared purpose. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. And I know you mentioned that it was in Senge's original model, the idea of shared purpose, but it kind of didn't get carried forward into the Harvard model. I think the idea of purpose has really made a resurgence in the past few years, and I think for a couple of reasons. I think the work of Daniel Pink and his book Drive, where he looked at what are the factors that motivate people, and it was, purpose was one of them. Was one of the 3 drivers of motivation. So with autonomy, purpose, and mastery. Yeah. So if we have a sense that what we are doing is important and matters, and if we are clear on why we are doing it, you know, we're more likely to put effort and energy into doing it well. The other thing is just with generational change, you know, a lot of the younger people entering the workforce are very values driven. So they want to work with organisations where there are strong values and clear purpose statements around that, and they're motivated by that. But you know, it takes a lot of dialogue. So to get a clear statement of purpose that people are actually aligned to, be it your staff, your customers, other stakeholders, it takes a lot of dialogue. There's a really good example of that. There's a company called Red Hat, who are an open source software company. You may be familiar with them. So Jacob Morgan runs a podcast, the Future of Work podcast, and he recently interviewed the Chief People Officer at Red Hat about their culture and their leadership model and so on. And one of the things she talked about was the process they went through to create what she calls their why statement. And it took a year of dialogue. They've got 14,000 staff. They tried to involve as many people in the dialogue around, you know, at its heart, what's our why? Why do we exist? And what they came up with was the statement, we believe open unlocks the world's potential. Like, that's pretty simple, right? But it took them a year to get to that point. And before they've even officially launched that slogan, their sales team had organised their annual conference around it. You know, it really resonated across the organisation. But it is, you know, it is something, there's a lot of conversation required to get right.
Well, and I've read the Pink book. You talked about drive, and one of the things he talks about, which I think is a classic error, and apparently the Red Hat people didn't do, is this notion that the bosses will come up with the vision statement, right? Like, and it sounds like they did a good job of involving everybody again. But I think it's a classic error. You know, like the managers will squirrel away in the corner office, and they'll come out with the vision statement, and we will all genuflect to it, but it usually doesn't.
Well, actually, we all sit there and scratch our heads and say, what the hell does that mean? And what does it mean in terms of how I act and my behaviours and how I work with other people? You know, often they're so obscure.
Right. And I think what usually happens, I'm sure this is familiar to you as well, is, you know, 2 days after, nobody remembers what it is or where to find it on the computer network.
Yeah.
And then the other thing he talks about in terms of purpose, and I think companies can forget this, is that employees do not think making more money for the boss or the stockholders is a purpose. And then Pink shows a lot of good evidence that even bonuses or higher paycheck for me, the employee, is not necessarily a motivating factor. The whole carrot thing doesn't work as well.
No, absolutely not. That more and more, it's about that intrinsic motivation and connection to what we do and why we do it. Yeah, absolutely. So that's what it takes to get people on board with caring enough to learn and to improve and to adapt, basically. And that's why that one's so important.
Yeah, you know, that's a good point, because I just had an interview. I don't know. Do you know the learning professional Patty Shank, kind of evidence?
Oh, yes. Yeah, very well.
So I just had a webinar with her, and you know, we were just talking about the fact that a lot of times learning is just hard, you know? And you're like, why would I do it unless you give me unless there's some greater reason for it, right? Other than make the boss more dollars.
Yeah, I think there's, you know, I talked earlier about blind spots, right? I think the learning and development profession has this blind spot around what learning looks like. And even people in organisations where a lot of people still think it's about training. And when I want to know how people learn, I don't ask them, how do you learn? Because they'll talk about courses and things like that. I ask them things like, how do you get better at your job? How do you solve problems? Because that's what real learning is, right? How do you figure out what you can do differently to make your day-to-day life easier? And I think, you know, a lot of the approaches we've spoken about aren't about training. A lot of the approaches we've spoken about are things that happen in the workplace, right?
Yeah, not to disparage new employee onboarding, but there's more to it than that.
Yeah, absolutely. To really unleash the power and potential of knowledge and of learning in your organisation to drive better outcomes. It's really not about what happens in classrooms.
Right. All right. So
it's about
4 characteristics. How do and I want to do it. I'm an organization. I want to be a learning organization. How should I start? Any ideas?
I think, as with anything, you need to figure out where the hell am I now? Yeah. And, you know, let's say someone listening to this is a team leader and they want to do more of this at their level. You don't have to wait for the whole of the organisation to get on board. You can actually do some things within your team itself. And you talked about some simple things earlier about, you know, lunch and learn. I talked about things like, you know, if you've got shift handovers or other meetings, introducing a learning moment. You know, there's so many little things that you can do as a start point. But if we're talking about, you know, the kind of bigger ambition for a whole organisation, I think taking stock of where you're at now. And I think that assessment tool from Harvard is a nice place to start, but you want to think about it before you use it and maybe update it with some of the things we've talked about to make sure it's kind of modern and suits your context. If you are a learning and development team, and I know not everyone is a learning and development team, but there's a benchmarking process, a free health check you can do with Towards Maturity, which is specifically looking at practices for your learning and development team and tactics. And they compare you, they benchmark you to the best organisations. And by the best organisations, I mean those where learning is actually having an impact on the business. So you can learn from that. But either way, some sort of benchmarking or assessment process or taking stock with open eyes of where you are, and then figuring out of those things, what are some simple practices we can start shifting to move us further along. Nigel Payne suggests that if you can't establish that clarity of purpose and a high trust environment, you will get nowhere. So he would suggest there are 2 critical places to start. Is around building trust and around establishing a sense of shared purpose.
All right.
So I would say they were the initial ones, and looking for practices you can integrate with work, I think is a really great place to start, plus breaking down silos. If there's any way, both within the organisation, if there's ways of doing more things cross-functionally or getting input from other functions if you're not already doing that well, or from outside the organisation, be it going and getting customer feedback data, talking to customers. Suppliers can provide great insight. You know, for bigger organisations, you can look at partnerships with research organisations or universities. So just start getting outside of your own like little silo and way of thinking is where I would start. So there's some of the key things. Okay,
great. So I think, you know, workplaces are classically full of stories about, well, we started this, but it died. Any tips for sustaining it?
So it takes time. So be patient is the first tip. You know, this is something that is years of work and then ongoing work to sustain and nurture it. It's fragile, right? A leader doing or saying the wrong thing at the wrong time can really damage trust. So keep working at it. Expanding experimentation and continuing to build experimentation, running lots of experiments, I think is a great way of sustaining learning. And in terms of, you know, the idea of lifelong learning, encouraging people to learn every day and building those learning moments in, building those practices in. Refining the technology, the way you use technology. It's not necessarily about how much technology you have. Technology is an important part of it though, because we often work in organisations that are geographically distributed, or we want to access the outside world and ideas from the outside, and technology really does help us to do that. You know, through platforms like Twitter and LinkedIn, you can find and have conversations with experts in just about anything all around the world, and people who are happy to share knowledge. You know, and are quite generous with what they share as well. But certainly virtual spaces where people can collaborate, can share knowledge, making it easy for people to discover each other and to discover, you know, if you've got processes around learning from experience, to discover what others have learned
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of it's around finding each other. So using technology for that. It's an integral part of it, but it is just one part of the solution. And I guess the other thing is just staying abreast, like that whole thing around your environment will change, it will keep changing, it will change quickly. So keeping abreast of what's happening in the external environment is really important as well to sustain change. You're never there, you know. There's always more to adapt to, yeah?
Kind of leads me to my next question. So we started it, we sustained it. How do you know when you're there, or do you never know you're there, or is there a moment like when the lights come on and you think, I'm on a learning organization here?
Look, I think it's good to celebrate your little wins and successes along the way, and to acknowledge, yeah, we are getting better at learning from failure, and I can see the innovation is improving, or whatever it is you're going for. Our continuous improvement practices are improving, more people are contributing ideas. But I think if you think you're there, you'll just get complacent. And I think the other thing is that there's still more work to be done on understanding learning organisations. Like there's people still doing research, people still testing ideas, you know, and pulling ideas in from different areas. So if you look, for instance, at neuroscience, there's still a lot of work being done on understanding how we think and how we process information and what impacts that. If you look at machine learning and artificial intelligence, you know, there's probably a place in time, and if we would have this conversation in 5 years' time, we'd probably be talking about the use of artificial intelligence in a learning organisation, right?
Right.
So it's about staying abreast of developments and looking for new ways, but keep it simple initially. Just get started with some practices that get knowledge flowing more freely around your organisation, and then make it easier and safer for people to share knowledge, to speak up, to take a little time for reflection and for learning and for supporting other people to answer questions and share their expertise.
Okay, good summary. So maybe start it, sustain it, and keep sustaining it. Is a better way. Yeah, absolutely. So you've mentioned a couple of resources. Are there some other places you'd recommend people go to learn a little bit more?
Look, I think I've touched on quite a few different resources along the way. So I think there's plenty there for people to start digging into. If you are in learning and development and you're listening to this podcast, I would recommend you look at the latest annual research report from Towards Maturity. It's called The Transformation Journey, and it looks at what are the 3 biggest barriers stopping us from achieving our aspirations in learning and development, because we're not making rapid enough progress at you know, building agility in organisations and building what we call a learning culture. So it looks at those barriers, and it looks in particular, there's one that I think is very relevant to this discussion, the barrier of cultural resistance, and the idea that you know, their openness to new ways of learning and openness to shared responsibility around learning, that L&D people are often saying, well, I want to share responsibility, I want to introduce more learning in the flow of work and more continuous learning practices and help people to be lifelong learners, but people aren't getting it. They don't want to play the game. So the research report from Towards Maturity tackles that and says, look, the organisations who are managing to break through that barrier, here's the things they're doing. So it's quite actionable. So that would be another resource to add.
Great.
For anyone in Australia and New Zealand, I am actually running, and you didn't know this when you invited me on, so this wasn't a setup, but I'm running some workshops in August with Nigel Payne on how to build a learning culture. They're targeted at learning and development people who are ready to make that shift from training and spoon-feeding people to sharing responsibility and building more whole-of-organisation approaches to learning like the ones we've talked about before. So they'll be in August. So people can follow me on LinkedIn to get details of those later on in the year.
Okay, great. Well, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah, and maybe I'll get a chance, be so lucky as to talk to you again sometime after August about learning culture, and we can even discuss how that's related to learning organizations. But you talked about LinkedIn. For people who would like to learn more, or follow you, to connect with you, how can they find you, or what should they do?
Yeah, certainly on LinkedIn, Michelle Ockers. That's Ockers. I'm very active on Twitter as well. My Twitter handle is @MichelleOckers. And I'm quite okay if people have got some questions or want to get in touch via email. So we'll just pop my email address in the show notes for anyone who's interested in that.
Great. And for people listening out there, Michelle earlier mentioned how there are a lot of people on social media and such who will share a lot of information and be very generous. And Michelle is certainly one of them. And I've really learned a lot from Michelle on LinkedIn. I think I follow you on LinkedIn more than Twitter. But a great source and like you're saying, very generous with information. So, all right, cool. Michelle, thank you so much. I guess before we go, any last words? Anything we missed?
So be brave.
Be brave.
Be brave. Be courageous. Try something. Involve other people in whatever it is you're trying. Be upfront with them around, we're going to try this thing and let's see how it goes. Get them on board with it. But yeah, be brave and just try something. Don't be daunted by this seems too big. Do one thing, make a shift and see what happens. Run an experiment.
All right, be brave and baby steps. Thank you very much, Michelle. For everybody out there, thanks for listening. I'm sure you enjoyed it. Do follow up and connect with Michelle and follow her on social media. If you're in Australia, check out these upcoming conferences in August on learning organizations with Nigel Payne. Is that correct?
Yeah, Paine. Payne.
And for those of you out there, have a good day. And Michelle, I'll see you on the other side of the pause button here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jeff.